Thank you very much for this nice introduction. And now, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon for those who joined us online. And we will have a small, let's say, a very short and brief introduction about the finance perspective on entrepreneurial ecosystems. I have first one question to you. Why is finance so important for an entrepreneurial ecosystem? Any idea? Or funds, cash, however you would like to call it, dry powder. Yes?
Money is opening doors, increasing risk, finding the right partners, distributing tasks to others, outsourcing, and so on.
Okay, so you say money is opening doors. Okay, fine, yes. What else? Right, funding is the main issue of starting a business. There are many sentences or let's say wise words around the financing industry, bad ones, good ones, specifically when it comes down to startups and entrepreneurial ecosystems. I heard once a saying that said, okay, well, you may light up a small campfire, however, you need some fuel to really light a blaze. And that's what's all about. So let's start directly with the finance perspective. We have many discussions in Europe, in the EU, about this whole private equity industry. Some politicians said many bad words about the private equity industry, where venture capital firms are one part of. But here's one who said, okay, we would, from Lakestar, one of the heads, he said, okay, we would have other discussions if, however, we've invested in Google, Amazon, and so on so far and had huge returns over the last 20 years. So I would like to start with some fundamentals. Some fundamentals you probably heard of. Then give a small market glimpse. What I will do here is about the German startup market, because since you should look on the one in Breslau and Wrocław, here I'm giving a market glimpse on Germany, what is there the problem, then compare it against the US and make comparisons internationally about where we see the big funding spikes, where we see the big unicorns coming from, and so on and so far. And at the end, I give an outlook about entrepreneurial ecosystems, what fuels a good ecosystem, and where is the so-called vicious circle. So let's start. Fundamentals, the importance of VC, some key terms. So some key terms when I talk about investments, I mean investments in the fund, I mean investments into a specific firm. So I use both finally interchangeably. Funding is, let's say, that we provide equity in a startup. M&A comprises all terms about M&A, meaning that it could be a building strategy, that I include more startups together, and so on and so far. And IPO, the initial public offering, which is, let's say, what every startup aims at. Finally, at the end, going to a public market, having an initial public offering, and then selling some of the shares to gain back some of the efforts taken via money. Investments I would like to describe as venture capital, the standard venture capital, meaning that there's a huge fund that invests into a startup. Then we have angel investors. What is an angel investor? Yes, please. Right, so it's a former entrepreneur or high net wealth individual who invests his money, finally directly this private money, into a startup. Yes, something to add? Okay, perfect. Then we have, or let's say this came up in the 2015s quite often, crowdfunding. Crowdfunding that many finally fund a startup. Is it that common? What do you think? Right. So crowdfunding really depends on the business model, what they aim at, whether they would like to grow organically without any outside capital. The problem is the crowdfunding is you have so many different investors inside, and then you cannot really attract big venture capitalists or private equity firms. They don't like it. What they do then, if they would like to invest in this specific startup, they try to squeeze out the crowdfunders. Yeah? Meaning that they squeeze them out and say, please sell all your shares to us. But then there's that one negotiates with many, and this is usually a huge of a burden. Okay, so what we talk about is when we talk about the financing. Here I show you finally the typical funding cycle of a startup. It usually starts with a seed investment, meaning that you start with nothing, you have some seed investors, which could be your friends and your family, it could be an angel investor, it could be even an incubator that invests in your business idea. Awards and grants and so on. Maybe on awards and grants later a little bit. You see here finally the loss zone. This is usually where you are deep, and the loss is where you start to invest, where you start to build up your business. Then you usually turn to, when you founded your corporation, to a venture capitalist, try to convince them so that they invest a certain amount of money, maybe with some milestones attached, where they keep on investing in your corporation, include more venture capitalists, and so on. In the later stage, usually this turns to the more, let's say, mature fundings, the private equity, here shortened as PE, and then hopefully at the end that it's either sold this business to another one, to a strategic investor, that you do an IPO, which is usually preferred, or even go from one private equity fund to another one, so-called secondary buyouts. But today we concentrate on venture capital as one of, let's say, the problems and the diamonds within every entrepreneurial ecosystem. So what are the basics of a venture capital firm? I've seen many build up. Dominic and I actually consulted one that has been built up in our spin lab in Leipzig, the accelerator of HHL. It starts usually that you try to convince so-called investors and later on limited partners to invest in your fund. They commit or agree on investing a certain amount in your fund, and then this fund is usually run by the so-called general partners or a corporate big private equity firm, and they manage it and receive, therefore, so-called management fee. Then this venture capital fund invests into specific startups, which are then called portfolio companies. After a certain time, those portfolio companies are sold. We will see later on which is the time frame, and usually over on sale to other investors or with an IPO. And then you start this whole circle all over again after the limited partners and general partners have been compensated for taking over the risk. So what is a VC? A VC is a financial intermediary. It invests only in private companies, a venture capitalist, so in a startup, in a limited usually. It takes usually an active role. Active role is that they help the startup team to build up their business. A VC's primary goal is to maximize its financial return, nothing else. This is their aim, and that's good so. And they invest to fund the internal growth of those startups. This active role, question to you. We have a lot of VCs in Europe. Some are funded by the government, and some are, let's say, private venture capital firms. So from big PEs, they're venture capital arms. What do you think? which of those constructs takes over a more active role? The one funded by the government or the EU or the private ones? Why? Private, right.
Because they have an own interest in the success of the company, because they have a liability to their LPs to make returns. So they're interested in their success, and they then also try to influence the success.
Right. The private ones are more active because they are really interested in this characteristic D, maximize its financial returns. The managers have really the ambition to create the financial return because obviously their payments depend later on the financial return. With the government back VC, it's a complete different story. Yes, they get some return participation, but not as high as in the private sector. And they are sometimes not even liable about what they are doing. If an investment doesn't work, it simply doesn't work. All fine. We write it down, it's done. Okay. So here, what is the funding cycle or the cycle of VC funds? Usually it lasts around 10 years. With 10 years, sometimes a little bit longer. It starts with a so-called, we call for funds, a so-called commitment period. This is where you, at the beginning, you raise the money, the LPs to provide a certain amount of capital, the so-called committed capital. It's first simply written on the paper. They have not yet wire transferred the money. And then during the commitment period, they start to invest into the startups. And then always when they need money, they call the capital from their investors. Why you don't call for the capital directly at the beginning? Why? So you mean the investors, the LP, so to say, but they're committed with a contract? No, but why you would not as fund directly call at the beginning when you start for all the funds that are committed to be invested? As you have the problem of an investment, finally, you have cash lying around, might be even having a negative return on the money market. You are definitely then under a so-called investment pressure. And last but not least, your investors would ask you, what are you doing with this money when it's lying around? And here it comes back to you. The investors have, during this time, better opportunities to invest. Okay, then after finally every capital has been called and the fund is fully invested, hopefully, we have the so-called management period where they build up the startups, really force them to grow, and then and even reinvest over different investment stages. And at the end, when the fund expires, start to sell their shares in the specific startups. What do you earn? You have a management fee. What is usually the magnitude that the management of the venture capital fund gets? How much? 1, 2, yes? 2%? 1.5 to 2%, sometimes even more. It depends on the fund size. Yeah? This is a problem with small funds. The smaller the funds get, in magnitude, finally, yeah, the higher usually the management fee in terms of percentage number, yeah, which makes small funds unattractive, usually for investors. And they get so-called carry, a carried interest and exit proceeds. What is meant by this, a carry, a so-called carry?
Part of
Right, this is part of the return after you sell your investments after a so-called hurdle rate, which is finally, which is given to the LP, so to say. You wanted to add something?
Yeah, to make carry interest, it's like a percentage of what exceeds the agreed amount of return. So maybe they have like a minimum return of 8%, but if they achieve 20%, then they get the carry interest is fixed percentage of that exceeded return.
Right, so after you have reached a certain minimum return, then your carry is what you get on top, finally, that you achieve for the overall investors, some part of it. But there are many, many ways how to structure a carry. Yeah? There are even absolute amounts and so on and so forth. And to really, let's say, motivate your team in a venture capital firm, you have usually insight for specific investment, not for the overall fund. For one specific investment already, absolute numbers fixed that they get when they sell it over a certain price. And there's then, let's say, a good friend of mine told me, well, actually, only this one investment that I've made, or only this one thing that I've made is, let's say, paying the shoes for my children for the next 40 years. So, and that was, let's say, terms of very small amount that he said. Okay. So let's look at the market. At the market, so the recent numbers over the last years that we see for Germany, so you see here the last numbers from 2021, obviously, because they came out this year. So what do we see as trends in Germany in the startup market? Let us start. Once you've made it to the top, you usually stay at the top. This is one thing. You can read it finally in the EY Startup Monitor, for instance, a wonderful piece of paper always in Germany. And we see that we have in the top 100 startups received already 25.3 billion accumulated. We see that we see more investments in mature startups over the recent years because they're growing more and more. And what we see is that Berlin and Munich are these startup hubs currently in Germany. If you go through it's a wonderful piece of exercise what you can do. Go to this Ernst & Young Startup Monitor for Germany and download the papers for the last 12 years. You see a complete change of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Berlin in 2010-ish was a very, very small spot. I want to add to what Dominic said before. What did the city of Berlin do to get more startups? In the 2010-ish. What did they do? At this time, there were not that big venture capitalists there. What did the city of Berlin do? If you found your startup here, we give you 50K. Very simple. And some may survive. Very simple. That's what they did over their so-called investment bank. Okay. In 2010-ish, you saw there still Leipzig. Let's continue, but some facts and figures. The number of venture capital finance companies in Germany is decreasing over time. You can even do this within regression, and you see it, that it slowly gets downwards. The absolute number of venture capital investments. But what you see is that the total volume invested is strongly increasing. We see a huge amount invested in 2021. You see here it's more than doubled. So this is a wonderful thing for Germany. However, the ticket sizes remain very, very small. Very small ticket sizes. usually that you align between 500K to 2 million euros. This is, let's say, the standard thing, and smaller ones with just 150K in 2021. And we see that venture capital is not the main funding source of startups in Germany. Usually, government funding, own savings, friends and families, business angels, and so on, and then after this, venture capital. Why do you think this is the case? Yes, please. Okay, right. What else to add? If you have so much government funding, then it's quite hard even for venture capitalists to compete. This is another misery that you see currently in the German ecosystem. Okay, one of my most loved statements from one of the Zamva brothers is, for a company, you need an idea, a founder, and capital. We cannot replace a lack of capital with greater smartness. This is a very clear statement. You cannot outsmart, as a startup, a lack of capital. Impossible. Even if we directly compare Germany against our direct neighbors in Europe, we see that, let's say, venture capital is not so important, the venture capital activity. I mean, if you compare it with others that are rather smaller as us, it's kind of interesting to see this. Yeah? In terms of GDP, yeah? So standardized over GDP, so this is a valid number, a percentage number that you see in here. Okay, yes?
Do you know the percentage
Of the United States, we come later to it. Yeah? United States is, and we will see that United States, without forestalling, has been very, very good, but changes drastically as well. Yes?
Could you maybe also explain why venture capital funding would be preferred compared to government funding? Because it sounded like you inferred that maybe it would be better if a higher percentage in Germany would be venture capital backed instead of government funding.
So the difference between government funds and between venture capital funds, yeah? If I would like to burn a fire, really, and blaze it, yeah? And I have the option to take diesel or standard gas or even kerosene. Which one would I take? If it should really blaze up. Diesel? I would kill the fire. That's government funding. Yeah? Gasoline is, let's say, maybe VCs backed by governments, and kerosene, so which airplanes use, which is burning quite hot, is usually the private equity firm, the really private venture capitalist. The problem is here with the incentive. If you have as an GP, as a management of a venture capital, the incentive in your contract to really push your investments further, you will more actively help them and really push them. Give them your network because you have the incentive. If there's no incentive for you, and let's say even half of the money is coming from the government, it doesn't matter what you do with it, there's no active management of your investment. Okay, if we look at, say, finally the financing rows, and especially large ones and unicorn investments, we see that there are many, many different VCs, and only one is from Germany. The others are coming just from the Anglo-Saxonian world, US and UK. Okay, benchmarking the US. What does the American startup VC market looks like? Direct question to you. Better as the German one? Huh? Larger, yes, obviously. Yeah. Yes, right. It's one of the biggest by far, right? Yeah. Okay, let's have a deep dive. Almost 50% of the unicorns worldwide come from North America. Fact. So unicorns are not that rare. Yes, they are quite rare in Germany. We see a lot of mega funds there. Yeah? So we have so many mega funds because after the financial crisis, what we saw is that there have been a tremendous amount invested of private capital, of high net worth individuals into the VC market. Because this was, let's say, their option how they could make money and return, which is, let's say, still positive. And not the standard S&P 500 investment. And we saw already only in 2020 alone 102 unicorn exits, meaning that a venture capital firm made an exit, whether it was an IPO or handing it to another investor. Let me directly go to the next slide. Facts and figures again. Distribution of unicorns worldwide. If I would have shown you the picture 5 years ago, there would be just North America. Now in the first place, it's Asia. Obviously, Asia is a huge market. It's not only China, it's not only India, it's all together. And all the rest, tiger states. Then it comes North America, and afterwards, Europe. So you see here still one of the biggest places is North America. The value of venture capital investments in the United States has significantly increased from 2020 to 2021. It doubled. And these are not million, as in Germany. As it's billion.
Is this sustainable or just a 1 year thing?
You ask finally whether it's sustainable with regards to we had a pandemic from 2020 to 2021 and so on and so far. Partially I would agree we will probably see this year how much is left over of it. But you can say that this pandemic was an accelerator of certain business models. Where they saw, okay, I can really do this in the digital world, but I cannot do that. And so they used it finally as a kind of pressuring point for the investments. And it was finally a pressuring point where a lot of investments have been closed, even though they were VC-backed in the fund and said, okay, doesn't make any sense for the next, let's say, uncertain times. I will say it will probably remain quite stable in 2022 because in the current inflation situation, and equity investments usually, if you call it so, are kind of inflation protected in a way. So you'll probably see there that it remains stable. Okay, and you see that the number of venture-backed IPOs has increased as well in the pandemic, quite drastically. We see an increase in mega deals. What is a mega deal? Which one do you have in mind for the last 2 years? In the US? Yes.
For example, Facebook buying WhatsApp.
Over the last years, right? This would be one mega deal. Yeah? And so you have so many mega deals that you can look in the whole industry. Yeah? This is one example. This is finally a strategic investor buys a VC-backed corporation. Okay, now let's come to entrepreneurial ecosystems. I can already say that what Dominic lined out, those 8 factors are quite important. I will write them a little bit differently because we in finance have a different perspective on the world, and therefore I will put them simply in 5 points. Location, entrepreneurial recycling, we heard this already while Dominic was speaking. Culture, finance, and service providers. So this is finally, if we look on the quick literature review from a financial perspective, what you see there. Yeah? It's a little bit different framed, however, it's almost equivalent. Let's go to finance. You need, in every entrepreneurial ecosystem, if you start, a critical mass of seed and angel investors. Huh? A critical mass, meaning that they're available, that you are able to meet them at certain evening events where you go. Huh? And obviously, they should have a good network to the big venture capitalists. In Berlin, this finally has crystallized that they have so many places where they meet together and so on and so forth. I remember that EY, who started with this startup monitor, started this already in 2009, 2010, that they simply had in their new offices every month an evening where they connected startups with possible seed investors, business angels, and venture capitalists. And all the big names were coming there because EY was inviting. That was the time when Berlin was not such a good startup place. Why is it so important if you want to have a good startup place, a good entrepreneurial ecosystem? As Zamva, one of the Zamva brothers, already lined out. If you have an absence, wherever you start this vicious circle, I will start simply at one point. Absence of major investors, meaning of no big venture capitalists, means that you have too few large VC funds, meaning not enough dry powder to be invested. You have startups that are undercapitalized. I have not put here an arrow, which what would happen is, usually, is if you have too few large VC funds, a lot of good startups ideas simply go to other places, to other ecosystems where they see the big venture capitalists flying around. That's why you see a spots, Munich and Berlin. Startups, teams are simply leaving other locations to go there. If your startups are undercapitalized, you have too few successful startups and lighthouse exits. What is a lighthouse exit? Like Google, like Facebook, like all those things, like Amazon. And you've managed to have in your entrepreneurial ecosystem one of those lighthouse exits, then the awareness increases for your place and the venture capitalists are coming from everywhere. So what can you do? You can do a lot of things. You can say, okay, I have publicly funded VCs as substitute fuel. We've already outlined what this may mean. You can make that startups are investor ready. So meaning that you turn from the missing funds to very smart things. This is how Berlin started to do smart things, having a very small entrepreneurial ecosystem. Someone knows the factory? in Berlin? Never been there? The factory in Berlin-Kreuzberg, let's say finally the spot where the first big startup place in Berlin started, years ago. And they came up with a very, very small ecosystem around it. Now they have the factory 2.0, so they've increased it and so on and so far. So this was finally kind of there, preparing the startups, being ready for the investors. So if they gain a big fund that visits Berlin, that they would convince easily those investors to keep them there. Yeah? It was about convincing possible investors that this is a wonderful startup hub. Entrepreneurial recycling, we heard this already. What was it again? After a lighthouse exit, what happens? Right. What we see is of a lot of entrepreneurs, after they made an exit from their investment, they become so-called serial entrepreneurs, meaning that they invest their money in new startups, that they help them grow. And this is entrepreneurial recycling, finally taking your proceeds from your former investment, putting it again into a new idea, business idea. So this is finally one of the fueling strategies for an early stage investment. And there you see finally what is at the end the circle, how it should look like. This would be the perfect world where we have successful entrepreneurs, we have VCs located, that they provide support, we have new young entrepreneurs, a vivid community, so to say, and so on. And this obviously accelerates quite easily. The vicious circle is specifically if you have good ideas, smart people dropping out of your universities. However, this one is missing. Then convincing VCs that you are a good place to be is quite hard. So this as a small input finally for the financial perspective. Have any questions? For you online or for you offline? Any questions regarding this financial perspective?
What would you recommend Germany to, let's say, push a little bit the VC funding?
To push the VC funding, you have to have, if you would compare it to Silicon Valley or to Tel Aviv, what was one of the accelerators there? Huh? Smart people that have a lot of know-how, that are research interested, right? You have good institutions that do this, and then where came the original budget from in the US as well as in Tel Aviv? Military industry, because they need obviously a lot of inventions. So wherever this comes from, it does not mean military. It could be something else. It could be, for instance, medical stuff. However, you need at the beginning always this lighting up the fire, the campfire. If you light it up and you have some smart ideas and you really push your people to stay here, as Berlin did it with just giving out 50K for every founder, so that they stay and not go to Munich. Really, this was the problem. Then you may attract venture capitalists that come, and if they see that you have good startups in your ecosystem, they stay and come back. And this is what I would recommend for Germany at all, finally, doing this on a broad range. Yes, please. Yes, it is government funding, but if you take this money, let's say first, in a way, not trying to be a VC. With the 50K, they simply gave people for an idea money, And this was finally what they used over the 1-year invention period for their living. Yeah, so that you gave them free time finally so that they could start their business up. It's a little bit different as in VC. A state-backed VC is usually very, how should I put it, they give you private equity, so to say, or state-owned equity, however, still get on your nerves, but not with, let's say, in a kind of active, proactive way. I could take you once to one of the funding rounds from a state-backed VC in Germany. That's wonderful. Okay, you had a question as well, yes?
Yeah, I never considered this vicious cycle, but it was quite interesting. As I'm dealing with the topic right now, how do you assess the importance of corporate venture capital in this context?
Okay.
Do you have an opinion on that?
It depends which corporation is doing this. Yeah? For which one are you working with, if I may ask?
No industry focus, but I also recognize in interviews that it's quite different regarding the industry, because sometimes the market entry barriers are way higher than for other industries, and that is, for example, one factor that I think mainly influences that.
Market entry barriers is a huge problem there, because then one big corporation, one blue chip corporation is comparing against each other. Yeah? And if Deutsche Telekom says, well, for us it worked quite well, their market entry for online business is quite small in contrast to, let's say, BASF being a chemical giant. So this is one factor, and another factor is obviously how corporate venture capital, how flexible it is. What do I mean by this? If you have a new kind of whatever team, however you form it, in your corporation or outside your corporation, if you at the beginning says, okay, well, here's my corporate venture capital for you, take it. However, to be very efficient, we integrate you in our company processes. The order process of pens and all the rest. It will not work. So there are many, many things that account for this. And the telecom, for instance, made it quite easy. They simply gave money and said, do whatever you want. Not do whatever you want, but we have some investment managers that help you performing. And if you look on the annual report, you see so many side investments of Deutsche Telekom that are quite well performing. And I think most of them knows at least, or you know at least one of the biggest investments of Telecom in the past years. Okay, other question. But later, maybe in the break, more on this. Then I give you a private note on this. Other questions? If not, then thank you very much for those